dying. People that have been involved in horrendous traffic accidents where the person you're driving with dies and you survive. What help is there for people like that? I just think we have to broaden the net to see what's going on with people. These issues do happen, and we need to be thoughtful about it. It's a psychiatric disorder that can occur following the experience of witnessing a life-threatening event. To be in the military, even if you are not in active combat, you still are dealing with the secondary trauma of that. And particularly with people that have TBIs or traumatic brain injuries, that can really be so devastating. If you've worked with people that have TBIs, it's very, very painful for the family, because they often say they're grieving the loss of the person who went to war, and they have to figure out who the person is that returned, because they're not the same people. That's what my mother said too, and I often wondered if my dad had TBI, but of course it was not diagnosed, because she would say over and over again that he's not the man she married, but she never divorced him. They stayed together. Just in the public, an estimated 7.8% of Americans will experience PTSD at some point in their lives, with women twice as likely as men to develop PTSD. About 3.6% of U.S. adults aged 18 to 54, 5.2 million people, have PTSD during the course of any given year. So there's a lot of people, and again, I see a lot of older people when in politics, when people are talking about having to cut Social Security. And, so many, I work with a lot of poor people, and, many of them, their Social Security is like $800 or $750 or $990. And their rents, and I don't know about your areas, but in San Francisco, it's just ridiculous. And renters or landlords are just, pushing up these rents, or Ellis acting people out of their buildings. This one woman, and I'm really worried about her right now, she's being, her rent went up as of August 1st. She had been paying $700, and it's going to be $1,200 as of August 1st. And her landlord warned her 2 months ago that he's going to raise the rent, and she said, "Do you hate me that much?" And he said, "I can get $1,200 for your apartment. Pay it or leave." And her Social Security is something like $780. So she could meet the $700, and she had $80 left over. And she can't find another place. She's desperate. And my staff are calling out to her on a regular basis. And and she's just one of many people. But she's really, and she'll say the word, she says, "I am experiencing trauma." Plus her son had jumped off the Golden Gate Bridge and killed himself 4 years ago, her adult son. And so she feels really isolated, lonely, and she'll say, "Why go on? Why go on? Where am I going to go?" We're not a kind culture when it comes to some of these situations. In 1997, for example, the medical expenses for vets was $16.9 billion. Currently, the medical expenses for veterans, including those who fought in the Gulf War and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, are well over $100 billion. And then all that about vets trying to get to be seen by somebody in the VA system, and all that craziness, talk about bureaucratic stuff, red tape, very difficult. And so when it comes to TBIs, the common symptoms of this type of brain injury has to do with difficulties with all of these problems: attention, memory, reasoning, problem solving, restlessness, mood and coping, behavioral control, sleep cycle, swallowing, etc., muscle strength and control. So if somebody has a traumatic brain injury, they're going to address the world in a different way than somebody that does not have that. And that's why so many of these vets can be so angry, just so difficult to work with or talk to. Because they have these really severe problems that affect their brain, just as dementia affects the brain, or just like depression or delirium. substance abuse. When you have a brain injury, the structure of the brain might be really affected in a very debilitating way, and you don't have then access to healthy reasoning, that you aren't really able to do that. I mean, when I reflect again on my dad and my dad's brother, they did outrageous things, that I could not understand as a child, but I can as an adult. That they didn't have what we have, is that we have a filter that says, don't do that. Stop. Don't even try it. This is bad. They didn't have that filter. Something happened. The person with TBI, as well as family and friends, may experience chronic sorrow, and I know that was what was happening to my mother her whole life. That she wouldn't express that emotion, but you could feel it from her. That something she had hoped for didn't turn out that way. And my whole family, it's not a surprise that so much of my work is in traumatic loss. There are reasons why we do the work that we do. And mine is clearly as a result of living in the, being enveloped in deep sorrow throughout my childhood. That's why I said horses saved my life, because they spoke to me, and I could be myself with them. And this sorrow is the continued experience of sadness that accompanies the developmental changes of the person with TBI. So, for example, my husband was such a nice, calm, caring person before he went to war. He's never been the same since he returned. I hear this not just by older women talking about their husbands, but I hear this with 25-year-olds. This one woman had a baby before her husband went off to war. Now the baby is like 3 or 4, and she's pregnant. And she said they came to see me because she wanted him to talk about his trauma, which he would not do. And she said, I have to get out of this marriage. She said, you are driving me crazy. You're so erratic. I can't live this way. And I've got these 2 kids. And she was serious. And he got all threatening and angry. She did move back with her family, and he did kill himself. And he wouldn't come to see me. And it was just so tragic, And she's the one who said that. And he used to be such a caring person. And we're not, again, we don't welcome returning vets into our communities. This one gentleman had said to me, and he was about 28 or 29, and he was a sergeant in the military. And the only job he could get when he came back was working at one of those big box stores. I can't think of the name of it now. Not Kate, but it was Walmart. And he got his first performance evaluation, and his supervisor was this 22-year-old man. And he gave him low marks and everything. And all this guy was doing was at night, putting things on the shelf. And he said to me, he said, Patrick, how hard is that to do? It's a no-brainer. I just did it. I just did what I was told. And he said, I got this terrible performance evaluation. And he said, I looked at this young guy, and I said to him, have you ever been to Afghanistan? Have you ever had to protect your unit? And he said, I started screaming and crying at the same time. And he said, and I quit. You can take this job and shove it. And then he realized what happened when he got out to his car, that it took him a long time to get this job, and he walked out on it. And he said, what am I going to say to my wife? And so there's a lot of depth here that need to be looked at, not just in the older guys, but in younger men and women as well. And so the VA has long held this leadership position in terms of gerontological research, medical care, and extended care. And so the VA has a lot of data in terms of what they're doing with older vets and younger vets as well. And they do, I think, provide some innovations in care. One of the things in San Francisco is that they do have a residential memory care clinic where people can live who have been in the military. And I know several older men, 2 of whom are in their 90s, who were in World War II. And it's such a relief for the wives who are struggling with the fact that they couldn't care for their husbands at home, but the VA is a place where they feel comfortable. And so when we look at TBIs and PTSD, it occurs following an unusually severe distressing event. And so we can imagine in war, having these bombs explode, even if you're not right there, can be very traumatic. That trauma is then re-experienced with these symptoms ranging from transient flashbacks or vivid nightmares to severe dissociative states that typically avoid all the circumstances related to the traumatic event, is what the older vet often does and doesn't talk about it. And one of the things that when I get called in, particularly to the VA, that in many of their locations they have bars where the men or women can go and drink. And I said to this one social worker there, I said, what do you think about having this bar there? And she said, I know, it's crazy, right? But they have to have this bar. And she said, and we don't distinguish between alcoholics and non-alcoholics. And she said, yeah, you can just guess, Patrick, that a lot of the men that go there are alcoholics. They're drinking alcoholically, but that's the way that they do. And we can't do too much about it unless they start falling down and those kinds of problems. But it's just, again, we feed people alcohol as a way to medicate them. But that doesn't help, and it really freaks me out that people are in their 90s who, again, like that gentleman said, am I dying? I think we have to really think about the quality of life and the ability for somebody to have a sense of what it means to be on this planet. And particularly people that have put their lives at stake to protect the rest of us. I just think we are not handling this very well. The person often becomes withdrawn and emotionally blunted. When I said we call out to more men that call in, these are the guys I'm talking about. That they're very willing to pick up the phone and say hi. They really want those calls, but they will not call in. And so when my staff or volunteers call out to them, we know the volunteer often writes in their notes, withdrawn, barely talks. And yet when they say, would you like me to call you back whenever the next scheduled time is? Oh yeah, I want you to call back. And then what I know over time, because I've been with Friendship Line since its inception, is that I know that eventually they'll open up, but it just takes a while. It just takes a while because they don't trust, very easily, and so they're withdrawn and emotionally blunted. Ballistics experts estimate that the head and neck together constitute 12% of the total body area that is exposed during combat. Yet 15 to 25% of the wounds incurred during combat in World War II, Korea, Vietnam, were to the head and neck region. The only place that was really totally exposed was that, and that's where so much of the injuries take place. And that, again, can lead to these traumatic brain issues, which may have trouble being remediated. We see that now. Certainly there's making a huge amount of uproar in terms of the National Football League and how these football players, after banging their heads since high school, wind up 35 or 45 years old and have dementia, after making bazillions of dollars, but they don't get to use it. And so that's, I think, a hopeful way for us to kind of look at some of these older men and women that are in returning from combat. So what are the clinical signs that we have to think about when it comes to recognizing PTSD in vets? Well, any period of loss or of a decreased level of consciousness, and this is related to traumatic brain injuries as well. Any loss of memory for events immediately before or after the injury. Again, if you've ever been involved in a car crash, you probably got very close to this, not being able to maybe remember what happened right up to that point, or maybe immediately after that. It's just kind of amnesia, which is, we know, kind of a protective device, but we know something about your short-term memory has been affected. and maybe forever. Maybe you'll never remember that event. Any alteration in mental state at the time of the injury. So, whatever you were experiencing at the time, if you were depressed or bereaved or whatever, there might be an alteration in that neurological deficits that may or may not be transient. So there might be a lot of dysfunctional neuronal activity as a result of that. And it's just a very hard thing. I was giving a talk similar to this, and this was to people with TBIs through the VA. And, it was just so overwhelming, their loss. And one gentleman stood up and he said, I know I'm not the same. He was about 32 years old. He said, I know I'm not the same. And he hadn't been married, but he said, I can tell when I look at my mother that something's wrong with me. But I don't know what that is, but I know something is. And to live that way, and he lives with his parents. And I said to them, does he talk about suicide? And the mother said, the dad didn't say anything, but the mother said, he does talk about at a point when we die, he wants to die too. So it's something to ponder, And what we see again with returning vets has to do with substance use. Vezan and his associates looked at returning vets from 2009 and 2012 in the inner cities, and only about 40% of veterans with any diagnosed disorder received some form of treatment for substance abuse. So there's a lot of vets, and we know the homeless population has a lot of vets in the homeless group, and so many of the homeless have mental health issues, substance abuse or depression, other things. For alcohol use disorder, the estimate of unmet treatment need was 84% in his study. Excessive alcohol was the greatest problem. So this is something that we have to really, again, sharpen our assessment tools when it comes to substance use among veterans in particular, but older people in general, and to invite ourselves to see, are my skills, in good shape so that I can really talk to individuals such as these in a way that makes sense. Any questions about anything we've talked about? I know the time is ticking away and I'm getting a little anxious.
Are there any numbers as to how many of these young servicemen are being transitioned into the police force and impact?
What he was asking was, are any of these individuals, these younger guys, or women being kind of moving into law enforcement or the police work? And what we know is that anecdotally, yes, but statistically, no, at least as far as I know. And I wonder about that and worry about that. So it's something that I think we'll probably get better numbers on now that there is more of a focus on law enforcement. I taught in the police academy in San Francisco for 10 years to each of the new training classes. And at the time I started teaching there were no women in the police force. So it was all men. And it was exceedingly difficult to work with them, to teach them. And I was talking about suicide in general, but suicide in the elderly in particular. And it was very difficult. And I still remember Sergeant Sanchez, who was the person who was their commander. And he would say to me and say to them, if they start acting out, come and get me. And within a half hour, they were acting out. And I said, do you really want me to go get Daddy? And they wouldn't even listen. So I would go, and then he'd walk in the door, boom, everybody stopped. And I said, do you have to go? Yeah. And he'd walk out. Then a half hour later, they were bouncing off the walls. And I thought, these people are going to protect me? And then, happily, women started being integrated. And then there was more seriousness. The women really set a tone. And so the guys would still act out. Not all of them, of course, but many of them. But the women really introduced a calmness that wasn't there before. And I would say always, thank God for women. I still say that, because look at how many women are in here. We'd be out there crazier than what we are if it wasn't for the women in this group and the men who are willing to participate in this and to work with people that have a lot of problems. And we can see how crucial this is in terms of military, in terms of law enforcement. We've got to figure this out. Just in terms of how do we get along with each other. We're really having a crisis, in terms of how do we do this? How do we work together? And I think information is very helpful. When we look at anxiety symptoms in male vets and civilians, Dr. Gould and his associates studied 6,500 men over the age of 50. 49% of them were vets. There were no significant differences in the percent of vets and non-vets with elevated depression or anxiety symptoms. Vietnam vets, however, were twice as likely to have elevated depression and anxiety symptoms than vets of other wars. That was one of the things that came out of that. So there was something about the Vietnam War, according to these authors, that made that group of vets stand out in terms of depression and in terms of anxiety. Why do you think that might have been compared to more recent returning vets and the Vietnam vets?
Because of the way they were treated when they returned, virtually?
I think that's really important. The way Vietnam vets were treated when they returned, and how were they treated?
Like badly.
What?
They were badly. They
Yeah.
got spit on. They were.
Oh yeah.
All sorts of horrible.
Yeah, it was not World War II, when they were ticker tape parades, right? There was real resistance to the returning vets. What's another reason why the Vietnam vets might have elevated depression and anxiety?
The Vietnam conflict was poorly defined and nebulous. What everybody knew in World War II was threat to freedom and our existence as a nation.
Yeah, it was very vague and confusing, right? And there was no clarity, for individuals. So when they came back, it was very different than World War II, right? World War II vets said, we helped create peace in the world or whatever. But people in the Vietnam era weren't sure. And this is what I often hear from people either my age or older when I ask them about Vietnam. They'll say, I don't know what it was about. And they were there. I have no idea what it was about. And the other factor was drugs. So many of these Vietnam vets that I've talked to or had just the good fortune to talk to were said we were just fed drugs. And I've been a drug addict ever since, And so there's just a combination of factors that culminated in these Vietnam vets having twice as likely depression and anxiety symptoms than other vets. Yes?
I think another issue was many of them, once they did return, they saw their entire platoons killed, and a few that returned after platoons.
Right, and I think that's the other thing, the number of deaths associated and the number of people that witnessed their whole platoon being killed and things like that. And not even acknowledging the number of civilians that were also killed as well. And how hard that is to integrate that, particularly if you don't feel there was some purpose, and then combine that with what you were saying is then we return home and we're like pariahs, no one is thanking us for what we've done. What a terrible way to live the rest of your life and try to figure out not only how I'm going to make a living, but also aging. How am I going to do this? I think it's just such a shame what has happened. And anxiety is understudied. Even now, this was in 2013, is not looked at in terms of vets. And yet we have this data. We know that substance abuse is a big problem, alcohol particularly. We know that returning vets are killing themselves at an alarming rate. But we just aren't sure how to support them or how to help them. And that's a problem. Social support plays a mediating role in the effects of mental health problems in veteran cohorts. So again, being connected, connections are what bind us to life. Being able to communicate with people and helping them find a vocabulary for talking about some very, very dark times in people's lives. And this is what is missing with a lot of returning vets. The aging Vietnam veterans suggest that more late-life psychiatric services may be needed to improve functioning in this cohort. The problem is that's going to cost money, and then who's going to pay? And that's often the issue. That issue exists with dementia as well. One of the fears about people that have TBIs is that they may develop, because of brain injury, dementia as they age. Right now, it's something like 5.2 million, mostly older adults in this country, have dementia, usually Alzheimer's type. It's predicted by 2050, if there is not a cure found for dementia, 16 million Americans are going to be dealing with dementia. 16 million. And who's going to pay the cost of that? So, it in so much of our world comes down to this bottom line, which is money. Who's paying for it? And that's a problem. Returning military personnel require the family's safety and nurture in order to leave behind war and press forward into civilian life. But as you both were saying, we haven't done that real well with a lot of returning veterans. Veterans can grow older when there is confidence that their base is secure, when they have a strong family, a strong sense of community, and that they belong. As I said, we have to keep in mind suicide ideation, and when people feel like they don't belong, failed belongingness, this not being a part of a community, being a burden to your family, can lead to suicide. Portraits of returning World War II vets have been enacted in such movies as The Best Years of Our Lives. For Vietnam vets, it was The Deer Hunter, rather bleak, portraits, where this was a little different kind of approach. But times have changed, sadly. So what Vietnam vets and other veterans, also have a right. They have a right to age as successfully as possible. And so those of us in the field of aging have probably worked with older vets, and we need to really, again, be hopeful when we're working with them, and that they have a right also to live their life with as much quality as possible. And successful aging is a concept that incorporates freedom from disease and disability, good cognitive and physical functioning, and social connections, and some kind of activity that is meaningful. We were talking about that before in terms of purpose. And we've got to work with people in terms of what that means and how they can be integrated. When we look at civic engagement, how many people have heard that term? Civic engagement, it's thrown around a lot. But it works on the prediction that the community is eager to bring older people into it. I was talking to somebody yesterday after the talk, and she's interested in looking at how Friendship Line might be helpful up here. And I said, when you start looking at this, what you want to think about is an advisory council of some kind, and you want older people in there. This service is for them primarily, and you want them to be a part of it, not a token, not just somebody, oh yeah, we have these 12 older people that meet, but that they actually have input, that you want them to have input. I remember seeing a presentation by someone from NIMH, and she said the same thing. She said, we'll go out and, and because people are applying for grants, and we'll say, do you have an advisory council of older people? And they'll say, oh yeah, of course. And then she says, I want to meet them. Oh, then they get nervous, because they're often just, people that don't even know what their role is. And if you have an advisory group of older people, I really hope you let them participate and you let them share their perception and what they think about the program, and that they have some meaningful involvement. I just think having older people sitting there is patronizing without giving them say we want them to have purpose, but we take purpose away. And I just think we have to think about that. Researchers estimated that fewer than 12% of all older adults are aging successfully. 12%. And what that means is, can I manage my health issues to the best degree that I can? Do I have assistance and help for that? You know, it's very startling when I see researchers that I have some belief in coming up with this information. Excuse me. We want to look at how we can help older people become aware of their body, how it feels, to experience a sensation of anger or sadness, disappointment. Speak with someone who will listen about your inner experience. I really urge us to think about that. Do we teach older people how to experience who they are, so that not like that older man in the hospice says, am I dying? And now recognizing that yes, and he lived for 2 weeks, you know. And I did think, and I said to him one day, I said, even if you die tomorrow, at least you have a sense of what your life is about. And he was grateful. I mean, he said, I'm so glad you're here. And it was just one of those kind of uncanny things that, and I know you know this, how you wind up in people's lives, you know, and I say, how great is that? How great is that? And you might wonder, God, how did that even happen? But I hope somebody is there for you as well. Yes?
I'm thinking of a dilemma with this part, you know, about speaking with someone who will listen about your inner experience, and how do we counter that, the resistance to that, and I don't mean professionally. I guess what I'm kind of asking about is personally.
Yeah.
For instance, I mean, my mom, you know, I have concerns about her, and but I do this all day for a living, and also because she's my mom, I can't do this with her and survive myself. How do you suggest countering that kind of resistance?
Yeah, I think it's very hard when we are the adult daughter or the adult son with parents who have lived their life closed off without even knowing they're closed off. I think it's really hard, you know, and I don't know how successful we can be at that, but I think it's always worth a try, you know. I know I said to my own mother when she had cancer, and I wanted to talk to her, and, you know, I called her, and she would say, bad news doesn't travel, and I'm going to get better. And I said, Mother, you have stage 4 lung cancer. You're going to die. Can we talk? And she said, no, I'm going to get better. So if you want to talk to me, you talk about that. And of course, that wasn't what was happening. It was very difficult. And I realized that it's very hard to be the son of somebody who's closed off. But I can work very successfully with somebody who isn't my mother. And it's
Or if they're not closed off, but they want you to be their therapist.
That's right.
And I don't, that's not going to work.
Yeah. No, I know. And I think that's why we as adult children grieve. I think we have to grieve, and I think we have to do just what you're doing, which is you're probably very good at all this other, but she's not going to let you in.
Yeah, do the things they suggest.
Right.
Taking the art class, going to the senior center,
Right.
going,
Yeah, I empathize very deeply with all of us whose parents are not willing to open up to their adult children, and I think that's worth grieving about, you know.
I think she's also saying something else. Maybe it is the parent who is willing to share that experience, and yet we have competing demands.
Yeah, well, I think that's the other, absolutely.
So it always has to be institutionalized.
Well, and that's why I think we can't be all things to one person. And that's why Friendship Line existed in the beginning, was that I know that people can't provide that level of emotional support. I see that with grievers all the time. What they'll often say to me is, and this is usually women saying about men, they'll say, but I want my husband to do what you're doing, Patrick. And I said, well, we're going to have to grieve that too, because that ain't going to happen, you know? And this is respite, you know. for him because he doesn't know what to do. To this day, my female grievers will say, my husband, my boyfriend wants to fix me. Or they say, don't feel bad. And then they come to me and I say, feel bad. It's okay. But my own family, no. And that's why I think we have to grieve that. But I think it's better to have somebody who is able to have that connection than nobody at all. And I know it's hard on adult children sometimes not to be that person. You know, I know that. And yet that's the way it is oftentimes. But I wouldn't stop trying. You know, and to say, I did say to my mother one day, she was visiting me, it was my 40th birthday, and I said, I want to know one thing from you, Mom. I said, I want you to tell me what you really thought about your 4 children, including me, because I would hear you say you love all your children the same. And I'm one of them, and I'm not sure what that meant. And she did. And it was really one of the most authentic times my mother ever had with me. And it was fleeting, but it was so powerful. And she said, oh, I don't want you to be upset and blah, blah, blah. And I said, I'm 40 years old, I have a doctorate, I have a child. I have this crazy job. I think I can handle it. And she told me, and it was really powerful. And I really thanked her for it. But I think that was, and then that window shut. And that was the end of that level of intimacy. She was not comfortable with that. And I knew to back away. So these are things we have to be aware of. One thinks that 4 hours is a lot of time. And it might have been for you, and I empathize with you. But I hope this was all right. I hope this was something that will aid you in your work. I hope it validated some of the things that you have been doing. As I said earlier, I hope maybe it opened your eyes to maybe some new ways of thinking. And I just hope that when we go out this door today, that we feel maybe a bit more inspired, that you feel a little bit more like, I'm doing the thing I need to do. And I really, really support you. If there's ever any way I can be of assistance, you have my email address. Please don't hesitate to email me, but just remind me that I met you in wherever I am right now, which I can't remember. But I mean, Redmond, Oregon, of course I knew that. Thank you very much, and thank you. Anything you want to say? Thank you.
It flew. It absolutely flew.
Well, Angela said it flew by, so that gives me hope for Roseburg or wherever the heck I'm going next.
We'll get you pointed in the right
All right,
direction.
thank you very much. Thank you all.